in case there's an issue. All right, I'm showing that we're live on Facebook. Good evening, everybody. So if you're here for the 7 p.m. live cast, please feel free to hang out. We'll be formally getting started in a few minutes. I'm here with Irene Rodriguez and Dr. Cristalis Capielo Rosario, and I'll be introducing them more formally here in a few minutes when more people join us. So feel free to get comfortable for what is going to be an enlightening conversation. And while we're doing that, I am going to share on a couple of my other pages, just so hopefully more people can join us. So if you are on the live cast here on Facebook, feel free to type in the comments where you may be joining us from this evening. I always
feel free to
like to see that.
For what is going to be an enlightening conversation. And while we're doing that, I am going to share on.
I know I'm on. I could hear it coming through.
Yeah, I'm trying to make this stop.
Yeah, as long as you turn the volume down on wherever you're sharing it, that will do it. So
yep, there you go.
Very good. So if you're joining us for the live cast this evening, you are in the right place. Okay. So yes, please feel free in the chat, if you're joining us on Facebook Live, to mention where you're from. It's one of my favorite parts of doing some of these live events is to see where people are joining us from. So we have Massachusetts, Chicago. Paula's joining us from Beaver, PA, one of our friends. Hello. Mara's joining us from Chicago. So welcome. As you might continue to trickle on here, please feel free to share where you're joining us from in the world this evening for what's going to be a very exciting live cast on Puerto Rico in general. And the specific topic for tonight, which we'll hear more about from our expert, is coloniality, colonialism, and colonial reparations. So I would like to introduce somebody who is very dear to me. She is like a sister. We've known each other now for 8 years or more. Irene Rodriguez, who is a faculty member with the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. She is our most unique faculty member because she trains in both EMDR therapy and dancing mindfulness and expressive arts. So she's the only one other than me who trains in both programs, and she's just very special to us. And Irene, we're just so grateful that you not only took an interest in our curriculum and what we offer here, but that you have translated it all into Spanish so that you can share it with your community in such a dynamic way. And I am just delighted that you suggested this topic tonight. And I welcome you one team member to another. And I will let you introduce our special guest and how you two connected.
Thank you, Jamie. And this is, I believe that the universe is behind all of this. And evidenced by, using our language, how I met Cristalis. Okay, and that was, we were like talking, that was a Wednesday, we were doing expressive art session, and she just logged in as any other guest. And I don't recall what we were talking about, the theme that we were working, but came up the theme of how to be a Puerto Rican in US. But then US, Puerto Rico is also US. So it's kind of like being between two territories. And I was telling her my experience that I don't feel like alien. I don't feel like an immigrant. And we were like just talking about how my father used to shame us because his trauma about the Caucasian or the gringo, how we call the white people in Puerto Rico, the gringo, they are like better. How he used to be like surprised when I was doing things in English. And suddenly she said, you know what? Everything that you are saying has a name. And then she started like to give us this beautiful education speech. So yes, this is Cristalis Capielo Rosario. She's an assistant professor of Arizona University. And I'm just happy to say that she's Puerto Rican, she's Boricua. So this is your stage.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I've never, for those of you watching, I've never done this before, so I'm a little bit nervous. But again, thank you for having this space. It's an honor, as Irene mentioned. I am an assistant professor at Arizona State University. I've been there since 2016. And particularly the past few years, my research has focused on understanding how colonialism, sociopolitical factors affect the mental health of Puerto Ricans, our pre-migration and post-migration processes. And all of this came about as, you know, Irene and I, we share a migration experience. And for me, sort of like, I remember growing up in the island and this idea that we ought to be grateful for the US citizenship, the ability to come here without, right? We just buy a plane ticket and we get here. And so that was the narrative that I grew up with. And so we come here, and my family, my parents in particular, all the challenges, the xenophobia and racism that they experienced many times for the first time. And as I engage in first doing my master's and then later doing my doctorate, just wanting to understand, even though we have been told this story that we were American citizens, that we could migrate here, that we could just come in and assimilate, how our experience here in the US is very different from that. And then digging into the numbers and just looking at the profile of health disparities related to mental health in particular. You know, that even when you control for socioeconomic factors, we still do, you know, our outcomes are very negative. And sort of trying to understand what's going on here. And it was a journey of self-discovery. Through this journey, I had to pretty much unlearn and relearn my history and what it meant to be Puerto Rican and all the things that colonialism had stolen from us, and continue to this day to distort and take from us. And so I started putting things, you know, pieces together from what other scholars before me had done, and trying to understand our migration experience, our psychological makeup and structure, if you would, from the lens of colonial trauma and colonial oppression.
So, Doctor, I hope you can just give us a working example, because I think a lot of us who are white have heard this term colonialism. But maybe are lacking a solid working definition, at least how you as Puerto Ricans especially might define colonialism. So can we have a little bit of background there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, for those of you who may be interested in reading a little bit more, there's another scholar, Dr. Nelson Torres Maldonado. He does a beautiful work of explaining this. But I think simply it's just, you have to think about it in two ways in which it may manifest, right? So you have colonialism that maybe you read in history books, right? The going over a territory, the taking of the land, taking the resources, controlling this territory in many ways, right? There's the type of colonialism and colonization where the settler stays in the territory, as is the case of the U.S. But you have also examples like in Puerto Rico, where it's still Puerto Ricans are the majority of the country. So it's a different form of colonial administration, if you would. But that couldn't happen. So colonialism, and Memi, a post-colonial scholar, also talks about this. Colonialism is not effective unless you have coloniality. And coloniality, on the other hand, is what rationalizes colonialism, right? Because for you to be able to take over and for you to be able to exploit resources, you have to provide a rationale for that. And in the case of Puerto Rico, it's the narrative of you're inferior, you're corrupt, you are culturally, socially, morally, you name it, inferior to the colonizer, and therefore that gives me the okay. It justifies, then I'm gonna come here and take over your finances, your politics, your society, how you do things, because you ought to be corrected. So you need both. to work. And particularly in my work, what has focused on is when that narrative becomes internalized, right? What happens when the rationalization of you are inferior, you are morally corrupt, it's no longer external, or it continues to be, it's not only external, but it becomes part of your own narrative as a people. So as a way to distort the cultural identity of a people. And Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans are only an example. I mean, you see this throughout this Dr. E.J.R. David, who's a scholar at the University of Alaska in Anchorage, who speaks about this colonial mentality from the perspective of Filipinos and Filipino Americans. So this is not unique to us, but my research has tried to focus on our experience as Puerto Ricans.
So I'm very struck by that use of the word inferior, how colonizers will play into that. Mm-hmm. And Irene, even as we were preparing for this, you shared a story with me about, if you're willing to share here, and we can use this for the discussion. How did you, and this is really for both of you, how did you internalize inferiority?
Yeah, and the sample that I provided at the beginning was how the narrative that was transferred to me through my father when I moved here. And again, the thing that what happened when we started the conversation, Cristalis and I, was like, I don't feel that I have immigrated. I don't call myself immigrant. I just move because I'm US citizen. So that also is a conflict. So who I am, kind of, because I'm still Puerto Rican. So what I learned is that the Caucasian, the American, the white American, they are better than us. They are more capable. So when I moved here, my family, they all were surprised. Oh my God, you find job? Are you working? Are they all gringos? Like this surprise, and then that create like anxiety. I said, what happened? What I'm doing wrong? Because for me it was normal. So that was a trauma that he passed to me. I do remember when we met was after I'm completing the EMDR training. Right after, I was like, of course, that's a good student, maybe overcompensating. Okay, trying to get more. I learned about dancing mindfulness. I remember where I was. I sent you an email and you were like, oh, of course, you can come to my home, you can stay. I was like, oh my God, like, so I saw you like this. So when I went to your home and like meeting the people, I didn't want to I want to give good impression. Not me as Irene, me as a Puerto Rican.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's something I've lived that same experience. It's something that I see on my data. It's something that scholars have. So this work that I'm doing right now, it was inspired by the work of Dr. Albanidia Rivera Ramos, which back, in the late 90s, she did this wonderful study. And I believe it was for her dissertation. And so she interviewed Puerto Ricans throughout the island. I think her sample was like 1,700 participants. And what came up from those narratives is whenever she would ask Puerto Ricans, how would you describe other Puerto Ricans? The themes were lazy, dirty, malamañosos. There's not a really good translation for that. And so one of the tragedies that she talks about in her book is how, even though the adults have been able to create like a dual consciousness, and Dr. Daniel Gastambide, he talks about this. He has an article about this, in which we're able to at least separate our own identity from that identity that we put on other Puerto Ricans. And I see that same dynamic, right? That I may see myself when I talk about myself individually and as a Puerto Rican, as intelligent, giving, hardworking, but I'm not able to extend that same, that same identity does not apply to my Puerto Rican sibling. And so what Dr. Rivera Ramos saw on her data is that unfortunately children were not able to separate that narrative. That children had internalized that, yes, I am lazy, I am, all these other negative, descriptions. And it's something, I almost 20 years after, for me, it was very telling that when I replicate pretty much her study, it was the same narrative. This narrative that that we're yeah, we know how to party, but we're too loud, and we come here, but we come to be dependent on the government. It was such a prevalent narrative. And when you think about it, it just doesn't make sense, right? Because when you think about, well, wait a minute, I work hard, and my parents have worked hard, and the people that I meet who are my neighbors who are, they work 2-3 jobs. My mom is a teacher here in Osceola County, and yet the narrative is that we come here to places like Orlando to damage the place because we're lazy and dependent, and so that's coloniality, okay. Right? That you internalize yourself as less than. And there's just many manifestations. I think for me, going back to your question, growing up with this idea that whiter was better, yeah, right? That having the straight hair, having the lighter skin, not having the button nose, having a narrow nose, that coming to the US to study, that, that all of that represented better. Right, that meant to be that's what you should strive for, while disconnecting from your own. And it's quite a split. You have to split. Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot there, and I think first of all, Irene, I want to thank you for sharing that with me, because I mean, I was not aware that was the messaging going through your head. And
yeah, and that is that is our process, and still now, but that is, yeah, still now. Mm-hmm.
So I think my next question then is, obviously, if we're talking of this in terms of problem solution, how to heal. And I think maybe we can start on more of an individual level, and this is where it can be useful to talk about. Let's start with, if you are a clinician working with a Puerto Rican client.
Yeah.
What do you need to know?
Yeah, right. And so I write about this, and I think when we were chatting before our conversation, is that, and I tell my students this when I teach the classes, is that you need to understand the historical context mm-hmm. of your clients. You need to appropriately contextualize the clinical presentations of your clients. Mm-hmm. And there's so many scholars, also from a Puerto Rican perspective. Again, Dr. Daniel Gastambide talks about this. And I joke with my students, the client may not come through your doors and use this language because they may not know it, right? That's part of colonialism too. The colonizer takes away the language for you to be able to describe it. Yeah. But what you may see instead, right, which is something that I see in my data, is Puerto Ricans who come here to places like Orlando, and they have these expectations about what migration may be like, right? And they want the job and improve themselves, and they start hitting all these barriers mm-hmm. Of not being able to find a job that is commensurate to their experience or training in Puerto Rico because they have an accent, or they can detect that they were discriminated against. And so those may be the clients that come through your door, right? The clients who may be experiencing financial stress, maybe stress related to being away from family, being here, being isolated, feeling, you know, the stress of adjustment and post-migration. But something that again, understanding the context and the historical piece, and also what's going on right now, is when I would ask my participants, okay, so how do you make sense of this, right? So that you came here and that you had all these goals and expectations, and because we're citizens, right, that really shook you. It changed for you how you thought about your post-migration life and here in the US. And so the answer was, well, it's our fault. Right? The reason why we struggle is because of the way that, of course, nobody's going to want to hire us, because look at how we're behaving over here. And so it's this dynamic of Puerto Rican liability, right? That if we face challenges here in the US, or, you know, it's not because of the systemic barriers that we face, but because somehow there's something about us that is making this happen. And so, you know, that is critical to know, right? Sort of understanding how is the client making sense of their post-migration stress and experience, right? In the literature, we talk about a culture of stress and acculturation, right? But what is happening? How is the person making sense of these challenges? And the reason why that's important is because in a lot of the literature on ethnic and racial minority psychology and counseling, one of those counseling interventions that you want to bring your client to do and engage in is sort of like cultural pride and connecting them to support, and how, you know, because we also know that having a strong sense of your collective self and your ethnic and racial identity are buffers against post-migration stress, against psychological stress, against racism and discrimination. And for us, what I argue is we may need to do some work before that, because something that I see on my data as well is, well, this discourse of separation, right? That I do not want to associate myself with the other, because then others are going to think that I'm lazy and that I come here to ruin the place, right? And so it's a very interesting dynamic in which even when participants talk about needing some support, perhaps from government, how that was okay for them, but not for their Puerto Rican siblings, and so it's important because clinically, you know, the goal is to, how do you reconcile those two narratives? How do you reconcile the narrative that you're hardworking and that you're good and intelligent and contribute to your society, but somehow the rest are not? And I think sort of helping the client make sense of those two, and perhaps through some education, maybe something that may be necessary for the client. So again, before even you engage in the work, connecting them back to cultural resources, to cultural groups, they realizing that at first they may not want to because of what it means. Right? We have participants telling, well, I didn't want to come to Florida. And okay, why not? Well, because Puerto Ricans are going there with their drugs and their behaviors, and I can't wait to get, but I'm like, but aren't you in Florida? Right? And I remember having the interviews with them, and here I am, I identify myself as Puerto Rican, I identify myself as a doctor who's doing this work, and I'm doing this interview from Florida, and in the narrative, they'd be like, yeah, but those Puerto Ricans in Florida, right? And so, okay, so help me understand this, right? That this is what you come to believe and understand about the other, but you're having a conversation with me and you know these other examples that do not, how does that make sense? Yeah.
Irene, what's been your experience with what Cristalis is speaking of?
Yeah, actually, that was kind of how everything started. We were talking about reggaeton, the music, and how I cannot relate to that. That like more like American, like rock, and I'd rather live what I live, where it's not that many Puerto Rican. But I feel guilty. But then, so I'm that example. What she's saying is my life, without me knowing that that was what I'm struggling with. And when she mentioned about getting benefit, I didn't request any COVID-19 whatever help. Even now, and I may qualify, I refuse. And when she said about benefit getting help, I said, no, I can support myself. I refuse to get any help from the government. So how then I also like victimizing myself because it's a right that I have. So.
And there's that idea of internalizing. So I know, Irene, you and I have talked about accents before. Yes. And I was looking at our comments. I don't know if you're able to see the comments, but
no, I'm not.
Dr. Jose Colon is with us, and Stephanie, and a lot of our dancing mindfulness friends. And I've had a couple comments come through about, feeling ashamed for the accent. Yeah. And I know, Irene, you have shared with me that that is something else that has maybe kept you from fully expressing yourself in the world.
Absolutely. And with that said, I have to thank you. And thank you, all the Institute for Creative Mindfulness Community, for kind of embracing me and allow me, giving permission or the freedom to express myself. I know that the accent is one thing, and then the pronunciation or the grammar, whatever syntaxis is another. So I'm kind of conscious and self-aware of that. And even here, I mean, for Lauderdale, South Florida, that my accent is like common, it's not a surprise. I'm conscious when I'm working with white Caucasian. And there are times that I say, hey, are you okay with my accent? Is that fine? And so far hasn't been a problem with clients ever. At least no one has complained. Even during trainings, so far it's been fine. But deep down, I feel that I'm kind of maybe like handicapped. Or less, or even when I'm trying, because my understanding is perfect. And sometimes I kind of joke, like, don't be fooled by my accent, because I get the joke. I get the jokes, I get the pulling my leg, all of that, I get that. But because my accent, I feel that I may look like that I cannot verbalize my what I know. I cannot find the words. Yeah.
Cristalis, can you speak to that? And just really in this climate, especially this political climate, because I remember one of the questions I asked Irene, I think it was after the 2016 election, I asked you if you've been taking more shit. Just, I mean, we all know what happened in 2016, right? I don't need to mince words. And it just feels like the whole tide of things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years has just emboldened a lot of people who are bigots and racists just to be even shittier. So, I mean, can you help us understand maybe what we as white people who English is our first language, what we could never understand?
Yeah, so connecting it to what Irene was saying, so I would encourage in those who had the questions about the accent. So another Puerto Rican scholar, Dr. Lilian Comas Diaz, I remember also in grad school struggling with our clients going to understand me, right? So I'm going to be super clear. And she talks, I believe it's in one of her 2006 articles, and maybe misremembering this citation, but she talks about how she turned that around and she used the power of her accent as a tool in psychotherapy. That it actually allowed her to have conversations with clients, right? And so again, interrogating, where is that coming from? And connecting it back to what we're saying is coloniality, right? Because when if you connect the dots, the accent, well, what is it about it that they won't understand me? And then what is it about that? Well, they're gonna think that I'm dumb. They're gonna think that I'm not as intelligent. And then that is coloniality, right? And you can trace it all back to our history, in which, you know, again, when you, there's so many scholars, and there's so many people who talked about this, but there's a scholar, Trujillo Pagan, who talks about how colonial interventions in Puerto Rico started with a narrative that we were physically, racially, culturally, and socially inferior, right? So again, if you say that, if you say you are inferior in all these aspects, then I need to act. The conqueror has to act. They impose things on you to try to fix you. Okay, so, you know, I remember my grandfather, who passed away, he would talk about how one day he went to school and all of a sudden all his teachers were gone, and now he had to speak English, right? And it's just how the intervention of changing and restructuring and redefining and altering your identity. And so of course there was resistance, just like there is resistance in Puerto Rico, right? Every day we saw that, especially last year with the Ricky Renuncia protest. But even in the moment of resistance, that in itself is used as further rationalization for more oppression. Because you do not know better. I know better for you. And if you resist it and you don't follow it, it's because, you see, you're bad. you're not, you need even further imposition and monitoring and correction. And so this whole thing about language and dependency, I mean, you can trace all those pieces back to our history. And so that's why I was saying before, you know, it's important. This is, I'm only presenting the case of Puerto Ricans, and based on the data and what I study, but you can trace it back. What we live today, you can trace it back to our history, to what we have internalized, to what's still going on. And so I think clinicians, you know, it's crucial to have that knowledge, because then you can externalize that narrative.
Okay.
Right?
So talk to us about the shift. Yeah.
Right. So you can, so it goes from, well, this is what I think I am, and this is what I think the other is. Okay, let's interrogate that. Let's look into that. Where did you receive that message? Right? So I remember growing up receiving the message that, you know, of anti-Blackness, right? That me and my cousins who had lighter skin, we were talked about differently than my cousins who had darker skin and curly hair.
No dañes la raza.
La raza, ¿verdad?
Yeah.
Right? Improving the race. And I remember coming here, my mom telling me, well, you're going to meet a nice gringo, right? And that was the only possibility for me, right? And so you start, well, what is that? Where's that coming from? Where did you hear that first, right? How is that true to you? And how, help me understand where this is coming from. And then if the clinician understands the sociopolitical context and the history of these narratives, then you're able to externalize them. Then you're able to say, you know, you told me you heard this from here, but if we trace it back, or actually this happened here, here, and here, right? So for instance, this narrative about protesting and, you know, protesting doesn't work, and and people need to follow this way. And there's this narrative, here in the US about how we would talk about our siblings in Puerto Rico who were engaged in the Ricky Renuncia protest. It was like, well, they complain about everything and they should just, and when you go back to our history, particularly when there was a strong effort to industrialize Puerto Rico and move us away from our agricultural origins and going into industrialization. And Puerto Ricans started complaining about the bad conditions, right? Because these U.S. companies were brought into the island under the premise that we're going to, better employment and better opportunities. Meanwhile, U.S. companies were doing everything they could to lower costs related to employees and not paying for infrastructure. And so when workers in Puerto Rico started like, wait a minute, what's going on here, right? Still our unemployment is high. We're still not paid as our U.S. citizen counterparts in the mainland. Well, no, you cannot protest. Right? All those efforts are suppressed. And so that's what we internalize. Don't fight. We depend on the US, right? I've had narratives of participants who talk about sort of almost as an abusive relationship, right? That they that there's inequality, that there is oppression, but the same participant would later tell me, but we still need to respect them. Because this idea of separating from the colonizer, it's talked about as chaos, right? We could not survive. We if somehow the U.S. ended this relationship, or this relationship were to end, my goodness, pobre de nosotros, right? Like, there's gonna be chaos. We may not be able to do this. And so we have internalized this inefficiency and this ineffectiveness as a people. And so when it comes here, when people migrate or when they have these experiences, then if there are struggles and if there are challenges, then it's not because of structural issues as they are in Puerto Rico, it's because somehow you're not working hard enough, right? Or you just need to change the way you think and change the way you are. And so how do you live in that world where you feel proud to be yourself and having your flag and being Puerto Rican, but somehow you need to walk away from yourself in order to be successful and be better? That is coloniality.
And I'm so glad we're talking about this phenomenon of internalizing. And I've seen both of you do this gesture as we've talked about. And I don't want to take the focus too much away from the topic at hand, but I just, if I may offer a reflection, where internalizing has been on my mind a lot lately is this phenomenon of internalizing misogyny. Having grown up very conservative, and I know there was a time in my life where I'm ashamed of some of the things I believed and said and did as a woman. Because that question that's coming out right now, how can women support so and so? And the answer is immediate to me. It's what we do to turn it inward. And I know for me, it was very much a survival response. And I think if we're talking about internalizing anything, misogyny, racism, coloniality, do you see it as a trauma survival response?
Yes. So yeah, absolutely. Right. So this is your context. Right, and others set up the parameters for how you ought to live, right? So you, again, tracing it always back to these narratives to our history. Whenever there would be resistance over these forced sterilizations, forced vaccinations, forced English education, when our rights were being stripped away, when we protested, when we resisted, what was the response? The response was often violence. The response was making some people, giving some benefits to those who didn't talk or protest, and then further marginalizing those who protested. So what do you take from that, right? What do you learn from that? You learn, well, I better stay within these bounds. Right. And so, right. Yeah. And it is a trauma response. And, Dr. E.J.R. David, he talks about it as this colonial debt, right? That even when I'm able to identify at times in my data, I see it, perhaps the harms of colonialism in Puerto Rico, well, we still ought to be grateful, right? And that's what we learned, because whenever there was resistance, there was a force to counteract it, and it was often violent. It was often as removal of rights and services. Well, I'm not going to let you put your children in school, or I am, even changing our way of giving birth, and how, even how the medical industry change in Puerto Rico. I mean, there's just so many historical points that we can trace these back, and we've been a colony of before then, a colony of Spain for 500 years, and then after this, still a colony of the US for 100. This is what we have heard for generations. Is being the same narrative over and over again. And so when things don't work out, as what's going on now with the financial crisis in Puerto Rico, well, it's because of your corruption, right? That's that corruption, anti-corruption narrative, that it is because the locals haven't been able to manage the finances, and completely divorcing that from the role, right? So I think Irene was talking, our hands are tied, but yet we cannot talk about it, right? So that is yes, it is because you learn, right? It's like walking on eggshells. I cannot, because Lord knows if I criticize the US, Lord knows if I resist this, what's gonna come to me. And even myself, as I had, I don't talk about this often, but sometimes the fear that I experience when I talk about these things, right? And how is it going to be received by my own community? Yeah. Will I be rejected if I talk too much about this, right? Am I being too critical? Am I being too political? Too much. Yes. Right? Am I saying too much? Because the narrative deviates, at least from my own experiences of growing up, and how and the differential treatment I had to have for the colonizer and for the US.
So Irene, as a trauma trainer, trauma clinician, how does all of this translate into negative beliefs that people can carry when they internalize coloniality?
We go back maybe to the core belief, to those like things that maybe what we kind of battle with the CBT, only like changing the condition will be not enough. We have them to target where that is coming from. And as before we started the live tonight, I was kind of, whoa, maybe I need to go back to therapy and work with that. Like, I cannot get what I want. That kind of like sense of powerless. And it's what happened. We didn't have options. Yeah. We didn't have options. And that, would you mention, Cristalis, those like historical point? We are not taught that. That is a taboo. Yeah. You don't talk about that because then you are a rebel, you are a left, you are like, you are a danger to the society.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. There's rejection to it. It's talked about in a derogatory way, in a rejecting way. Absolutely. I mean, for me, this experience happened here. Right. I never had the opportunity to learn my own history in Puerto Rico, other than where the rivers are and where the, I remember just like those little, very superficial. But I think, Jamie, connecting it to your question, it's how do you work with this? And I think something important to mention is, at least from what we see in the data, and all this data has been collected with first generation Puerto Ricans. So these were Puerto Ricans who were born and raised in Puerto Rico and then migrated as adults. And I know that there's other scholars who are doing work with other generations of Puerto Ricans. And of course, making sure, right, that this is not a universal experience, that there's nuance to this. But even when I've been working with my colleagues on this project on coloniality schemas, right? So how do you organize yourself, the other, their behaviors and their feelings, and something that we started noticing on the data is that even when we talk about ourselves in a positive way, Okay. Even the themes of what is positive, you can trace back to coloniality. So something that Rivera Ramos also had on her data, and I was able to replicate on mine, was we are, I'm going to say it in Spanish because it's hard to translate, servicial. Like we're very hospitalarios. Like our emphasis is on serving others.
Yeah.
Right. So there were some characteristics about where I'm hard, but even hardworking, right? And coloniality also defines labor and puts the value of the person is labor.
Mm-hmm.
So even when those characteristics that we talk about ourselves, and you could put them on the umbrella of positive, there's stuff in there.
Yeah, for
right.
sure.
There's things in there that are still defined by coloniality, and so this idea that well, what happens when you don't fit that, right? What happens when you are not able to, maybe now in this pandemic, to work as hard? What does that do to your self of identity?
Yeah.
Right? Are you then by definition lazy? Mm-hmm. And then so it's there's a lot of work. How are you defining hardworking? How are you defining servicial? How are you defining hospitalario? That was another, right? Like, we're very giving. We open our house to everyone, and this is how we ought to be.
And even we have that phrase like, es más bueno que el pan. How you said that? Like, it's even better than a bread.
Mm-hmm.
It's like whoa, even like whatever they have in the mouth, they give it to the other. They give what they don't have to the other. So it's what we've been taught that we are.
So it's this idea that that our worth is always in relationship to what we can give. In terms of labor, in terms of, and so then me, what about me? And so again, just from a clinical, it's so critical to understand, and this goes for all clients, right? And a lot of times what we may be able to find is that these narratives, these core ideas, these core narratives that people use to talk about themselves and the others, we can trace it back to a sociopolitical point in history and structure and institutions.
Yeah. There's so much here. I feel I can talk for hours, and maybe Irene, this is material for a whole workshop, because you know, Cristalis, when I hear you speak, I am reminded of the potency of connecting one's history with one's internal narrative. And Irene, I've always said in EMDR, I love that Dr. Shapiro calls it client history instead of just assessment or intake, because my undergraduate was in history. And I often feel that was some of the best preparation I got for being a therapist, being able to connect history. And there's so much what you're talking about here that leads to what we're learning about epigenetics and trauma getting passed down in the DNA and in the body. And you made a very, you know, salient point that I've known intellectually, but it really struck me tonight, that not only were you colonized by the United States, but Spain before that.
And not only that, okay, whoever came with Christopher Columbus were the criminal.
Yeah.
From Spain. So that is our ancestor. Criminal from Spain.
Yeah, I think there's I think it's Tony Croato for maybe Puerto Ricans who may be listening to. There's a song called Alabanza, right? And it talks about just the history of the brutality that we have experienced for centuries. And we carry that in our blood. We carry that in our bones, and we think about it even when we don't have a language for it. And it may not manifest as, you know, as I said, you know, your client may not come about, you know, colonial mentality and you know, many may not be able to put language to it, but you may hear it in how they talk about themselves, how they talk about others, how they may want to separate from, and how that erupts them, right? It erupts them from community resources. It robs them from being able to connect. And so that's what the clinician may see and how they view their about what a Puerto Rican woman should look like and should behave like, and what Puerto Rican, you know, and all these different identities, right? And so it's a constant relearning. It's a constant relearning that we have to do. Sort of what was I taught, interrogating that, where does that come from, and learning something new and challenging those narratives. That has been my healing. That's how I teach my students to talk about this part of healing as well.
Brilliant. So in our last 10 minutes or so, I'd like to ask you both about, you take this question one of two directions. I hate the word fix, because I know my gut is saying, well, how do we fix this? Because again, like I said, you don't need us to fix you. And so I want to hear from you. What do you feel is the solution to what we've been talking about tonight? So that's one part of the question. And then the other part of the question is, what would you like white folks to know in this journey of healing and restoration and reparation?
I mean, I think for me, and I mentioned this on my writings too, is that you cannot divorce our experience from our politics. And this journey of healing for us and psychological reparations that Dr. Pedro Malave, I believe he's a law scholar at the University of Florida. You know, we deserve, we need to forge a process of decolonization, right? You cannot, it will be ineffective, and dare I say unethical, to work only at the individual level when you know that this is about systems of historical and contemporary oppression. That as long as colonial oppression continues in Puerto Rico, these are the narratives that are going to be told about us. And so what do? I think as people who, because of our ethics, right, in counseling and psychology, our role as advocates is not only, right, so we have a professional responsibility to challenge and to identify and to challenge institutions of oppression. And so for Puerto Ricans, that also means political oppression. That means changing and challenging our political status. And I won't speak about what I think, because I don't think we won't have enough time. But what do you do as researchers, as clinicians, is calling attention to the psychological trauma and the ongoing trauma that colonial oppression has had in our communities, continues to have in our communities. And hey, we need to change this. We need to advocate against this. And so our psychological liberation must be accompanied by our political liberation.
Amen.
Yeah, and from my part, and we do that if we are like trauma-informed, trauma-focused. Just ask, what do you need? And we shouldn't assume, and most of the information that Cristalis have shared is like she was able kind of to put name of most of the things that I've been feeling. Just ask and give us permission just to get our voices out. And normalizing, I don't want to say the word normalizing, that is part of the culture. That is part of what we are, without putting labels of, oh, it's loud or it's different. I mean, we are not different. This is what we are. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's giving us the space just to be. And yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart, Irene, for bringing this topic to me. I not only feel like I learned a lot as a clinician, as a clinical educator, but more importantly, I feel I learned more about my friend that I've never known. And I always thank my friends who are willing to share their journey with me. And for you tonight, especially sharing this aspect of your journey that I was not fully aware of. So muchas gracias, amiga mía.
Gracias.
So, Dr. Cristalis, how can people get in touch with you if they might want to connect with your work? Do you have a social media presence or email? Or
yeah, I on Twitter I am Boricua Psych. So for Puerto Ricans, it's BORICUA and then PSYCH. I also have the website for my lab, which is Plena, PLENA research.org, just plenaresearch.org. And if you look me up at ASU, I think my emails will be the easiest way, is my first initial and my first last name. So C Capielo, CAPIELO at asu.edu.
Great. And I put both of the social medias in the comments, and I hope both of you have a chance later to go back and look at the comments. A lot of wonderful things were said. A lot of our Puerto Rican friends who joined us contributed to the conversation as well. And Irene, tell people, I mean, they could find you through anything, Institute for Creative Mindfulness, but for your practice specifically and your social media and your projects, what would you like to share?
Yes, so my website is mindfuljourneycenter.com. And I have an Instagram account that is mostly about expressive art therapy. Is at mindful Irene _mindful journey. Or go to the page of the Institute and I'm there.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart. And I already articulated, I think we could talk for hours more. So we may have to correspond about having a part 2 to this, or perhaps putting together a larger workshop. So have a very good night.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Cristalis.
Take care.